Hello my friends. My name is Bot Mathematician, and this is Holomancer.
Also welcome the daring reporter Dora.
We are infinitely grateful that we have another opportunity to see you all again.
According to the description from the Hearthstone wiki, core is the primary card set of the game. The purpose of the core is to provide a modern collection of starting cards to players of all types, and make Hearthstone even more approachable for newcomers.
To keep the set relevant, the Hearthstone team annually removes useless tools and instead introduces promising cards from older expansions, as well as implementing numerous balance changes to make the cards more competitive in the current environment.
But is the core set really the basis for Hearthstone? In our opinion, the influence of the set is somewhat exaggerated. A year ago, 72 cards were added to the core set. According to our data, only 28 of them are currently useful. In total, out of 282 cards, only 81 cards are used in meta decks.
The main disadvantage of the core set is the presence of a large number of classic cards, which even after a significant rebalance, do not meet modern game standards. The same goes for cards from older expansions. Most often, they are useful only if specific synergies are deliberately created for them.
For example, Shadowed Spirit is an extremely weak card, but it has proven to be a very important tool in the undead archetype. The same goes for Fiendish Circle. A completely useless card has become indispensable due to the extremely strong synergy within the imp archetype. In our opinion, the main idea for some archetypes is that you are forced to use extremely weak cards in order to benefit from new tools that have a huge utility ratio. Despite the shortcomings, we like the concept of the core set. We love the idea that old cards can get a second life. But against the background of power creep, the influence of the core set is not significant. This leads to a paradoxical situation. The more cards we get, the less variety we have. We discussed this problem in our previous video. Don't miss it. Before we continue, we want to welcome our new sponsor Henrik Mario Hospoda. Dear friend, thank you so much for joining us. We also want to express our huge gratitude to our regular sponsors. Dear friends, any help in the form of clicking the like button, reposting, subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications and of course sponsorship is extremely important to us. Thanks to each of you for your kindness and support.
Let's jump straight into the cards that have been rebalanced and try to figure out their potential power level numerically. For this we will use our utility ratio algorithm. Our method is based on determining the nominal value of the card's components and comparing them with the classic Hearthstone basis. This approach is great for keeping track of the power creep level.
You can learn more about the logic of our mathematics in our video about Hearthstone patterns.
Let's start with Consecration. The classic version of the spell followed the pattern between damage and cost for AoE effects, but also had the additional value of damaging the opponent's hero. For 9 years, we have received too few spells that deal damage to all enemies. The card has stable value, which means that under any circumstances you will receive all the advantages in full. To determine the utility ratio, you need to divide the nominal maximum and minimum value by the actual cost. In this case, the indicator is 1.5. The base value for classic Hearthstone is 1. A large number of cards corresponded to this figure, but this does not mean that these cards were good enough for competitive play. Rather the opposite, but this is a conditional reporting point for power creep in the game. Thus, initially Consecration was 50% more powerful than the basic Hearthstone standard, but this value is not enough for modern Hearthstone. For this reason, the developers have reduced the cost of the card to make it more competitive. Thus, the utility ratio has increased by another 50% compared to the baseline and is now 2. Is it enough? Perhaps yes, if the Holy Synergy does not have enough tools during the first expansion phase.
Hellfire has matched the game's base balance for many years, but after the cost reduction, the spell will be 30% stronger compared to the baseline.
Fan of Knives is another AoE spell that fully matched the basic balance of Hearthstone, but only in its original form during the alpha test. Subsequently, the card received an additional draw effect, and now has reduced its cost, which increased its utility ratio by another 70%.
Babbling Book received a hit point increase. This also increased the utility ratio by half a point. Getting a random card has the lowest value for cards that generate resources. In modern circumstances, this effect looks too weak, especially considering that in the new expansion we received a large number of cards that are able to copy resources in your hand. The cards in your deck have a lot more utility than a random card. The same goes for Swashbuckler and Jeweled Macaw. These cards received the same results according to our algorithm.
Psychic Conjurer got slightly different results. A random card from the opponent's deck will usually have a higher quality than just a random card from a specific pool.
Menacing Nimbus is another card that generates a random tool from a certain pool. The minion stats now fully match the base standard, but the overall utility ratio is significantly lower compared to previous cards. But that's the norm since the Hearthstone team originally gave 1 mana cards an increased level of power.
The classic cost of the transformation effect was 4 mana. The developers broke this pattern. Thus, Hex received an additional 30% of the base utility.
Weapons are one of the most unique card types and have the biggest potential utility, but the downside is the varying value depending on the reconciliation scenario. If you deal damage to enemy minions, you lose hit points, which is a negative consequence, but if you constantly deal damage to the enemy hero, you only gain benefits.
Despite the fact that Hammer of Wrath combined 2 different effects, it completely corresponded to the original basis. After changing the cost, the utility increased by 30%. In modern Hearthstone, cards that deal 3 damage and have an additional effect typically cost 2 mana, but must meet certain criteria to activate the effect. The advantage of Hammer of Wrath is the activation of the effect in full and under any circumstances. There is a good chance that the card will prove useful, at least during the first phase of the year.
Increasing Elven Minstrel's stats only increased his usefulness by 10%. The big advantage of the card is the relatively easy way to activate the draw effect and combo potential, as the card is able to give you a specific type of cards from the deck.
Ancestral Knowledge finally lives up to the original Hearthstone standards. In place of 2 Overload mana crystals, the card will block only 1 mana crystal on your next turn. I was always surprised by such a high cost of a spell.
Significant change in Ancient of Law stats, and a proportional increase in the strength of the healing effect, did not significantly affect the utility numbers.
Druid of the Claw has received some very strange changes. In cases where you choose to transform into a minion with Rush, at best you will deal damage and leave the creature alive, which will create additional benefits. In the worst case, your creature will die. The cost of the card has increased as well as the stats, but these changes did not significantly affect the changes in the utility ratio.
Soul of the Forest will reduce its cost by 1 mana. The spell has delayed value and an unstable advantage that can be affected by the opponent. Your benefit will depend on the number of summoned creatures. In the worst case scenario, you won't be able to summon any treants. In the best case you will summon 7 minions. But the difficulty of getting maximum value is very hard. Even at 3 mana, the card doesn't look strong enough for modern competitive play.
Savannah Highmane will increase his attack by 1, but this fact had almost no effect on the utility ratio. The card looks extremely weak by today's standards.
Metamorphosis was a hugely popular spell after the release of Demon Hunter, but after the nerf, the card was no longer useful. Blizzard will reduce the cost of the card, but the spell still doesn't seem strong enough. In fact, the card allows you to deal 8 damage over 2 turns for 6 mana, but in the worst circumstances you can only use the effect once.
Flame Geyser will cost slightly less after rotation. In terms of damage, the card now fully corresponds to the baseline value, but the card has an additional generation effect. Let's try to evaluate this in a complex. For 2 mana, you deal 2 damage and can play a 1/2 elemental. Your benefit will be stable and fully match the invested mana. Despite the buff, it looks too weak by today's standards. Let's apply the same logic to determine the usefulness of Witchwood Apple. Since it is more important for us to determine the advantage of the received tokens, the developers proportionally changed the effect and cost of the card. In real circumstances, your utility ratio will not change at all and will remain incredibly low.
Let's move on to a card that can increase the utility of tokens. The Grime Street Outfitter was the reference for the Alliance Bannerman. Blizzard increased stats to make the minion more competitive. On your second turn, you can buff 1 or even 4 creatures in your hand and nominally increase their cost by 1 mana. The card has a fairly good utility factor, but Alliance Bannerman gave more advantages. Armageddillo is another buffer. The card has a long-term action effect and can be useful for several turns. Under the worst circumstances, you will only buff 1 creature, in the best case, You can increase the stats of at least 4 creatures and 2 more on the next turn. But getting the maximum value will be almost impossible without the strong synergy of the taunt mechanics and without additional drawing tools.
The Black Knight after the change will have a good utility ratio. The only drawback of the card is a very situational effect that makes this card almost meaningless.
The original version of Holy Champion has a variable value. In the worst case, you will not be able to activate the effect, but the long-term action feature allows you to also receive benefits during the following turns. In cases where you activate the effect 4 times, your maximum value will be almost 11 mana crystals. After changing, under the same conditions, the utility ratio will increase by 110%. But at the same time, the overheal keyword limits the possibilities of the card. It will be much more difficult for you to achieve maximum value.
The opposite happened with Mana Geode. A feature of overheal is the ability to activate the effect, even if the creature has full health. Despite this, the utility ratio hasn't changed. The change in the description just slightly reduced the difficulty of getting the maximum value.
Crimson Clergy completely changed its effect and became a replacement for Northshire Cleric, but the card is a much lower quality copy. Under the best circumstances, you can draw 2 cards in 2 turns. Of course, you can get more benefits if you cast more life-restoring spells. The card has a very high utility ratio, but it will not be easy to get the maximum value.
We've saved the potentially strongest card for last. Wrathscale Naga received a slight stat boost, but the card was pretty strong without it. In ideal circumstances, you can deal 3 damage to random enemies 6 times. Of course it won't be easy, but even if you get less benefit your utility ratio will be quite high in most cases.
These are all the cards that we wanted to discuss with you today, but these are not all the tools that received balance changes. In general, we are waiting for buffs of 40 cards.
What do you think of all these balance changes? Will buffs make most cards competitive enough?
Share your opinions in the comments and also vote for the best legendary card from the Festival of Legends on our community tab.
Finally, we would like to welcome our new subscribers to our mathematician squad.
For technical reasons, we only see nicknames of public subscribers. These are users who do not have the subscription section hidden on their channel. Also thanks to every non-public user.
Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for spending this time with us. We really hope that we will have the opportunity to get in touch in the next video.
Take care of yourself.
And never give up.
Job's done.